You're 8 years old, Mesopotamia, 4,000 years ago. Clay tablet in your lap, stylus cutting into wet clay. Your hand aches already. Your teacher stands behind you, waiting. One mistake and you start the whole line over. This is your morning, every morning, before the sun even clears the wall. Here's the thing nobody tells you. Ancient school could be more brutal than anything you ever sat through, but it also built something in these kids that modern classrooms rarely do. Stay with that ache in your hand for a second, because it's not random. It's not just some teacher having a bad day. It's a system, a designed one. And by the end of this, you're going to look at that tablet completely differently. The school you're sitting in has a name. The Sumerians called it the Eduba, literally tablet house. You're not just a student, you're a Eduba, a son of the tablet house. And that phrase alone tells you something. This isn't a hobby. This is an identity you're being carved into, one wedge-shaped mark at a time. Your teacher is called the Umia. He doesn't explain gently. He doesn't praise. There's a proverb from this exact time period that basically sums up the whole philosophy. A student who doesn't study hard will regret it. Not might, will.
That's the deal on offer. Here's where it gets interesting. We're not guessing about what your day feels like. Archaeologists found a tablet, scholars now call it school days, where a student wrote out his own account of a rough day at school. He shows up late, beaten. His handwriting isn't neat enough, beaten. He talks in class, beaten. He stands up without permission, beaten. By the time you finish reading it, you start to wonder if there was anything that wasn't a beating offense. But here's the twist that makes this story so much stranger than simple cruelty. That same student goes home and tells his dad how bad it was. And the dad's solution isn't to pull him out. It's to throw a dinner party for the teacher. Feed him well, give him a new robe, a ring, flatter him. And by the end of the tablet, the teacher is praising the boy in front of the class, saying he's going to be the finest of his peers. Read that twice. The system beats a kid into the ground, and the fix isn't rebellion. It's buying your way into the teacher's good graces. That's not a bug in ancient education. That's the actual mechanism. You weren't just learning cuneiform.
You were learning how power works, how relationships get built under pressure, how to survive a hierarchy that isn't going anywhere. The clay was never the hard part. Think about what an actual day looked like inside that mud brick room. You'd start by copying yesterday's lesson from memory, line by line, onto a fresh tablet. No reference to check against, just your own recall and the ache in your fingers telling you if you'd gotten sloppy. Wedge-shaped signs, hundreds of them, each one meaning something slightly different depending on the sign next to it. Mix them up, and you're not just wrong. You're rewriting the whole line, sometimes the whole tablet, while the Umia watches. There was no partial credit in cuneiform. Close enough wasn't a category that existed. And this mattered because of what was on the other side of it. Literacy in Mesopotamia wasn't a nice to have, the way it can feel today. It was the entire on-ramp to power. Scribes ran the temples, the palaces, the courts, the tax records, the contracts, the law codes. If you could read and write cuneiform, a script with hundreds of signs, took years to master, you weren't just employable, you were essential. Untouchable in a way most people in that world could never be.
So yes, the discipline was brutal, but you were being handed the one piece of technology in the ancient world that functioned like a permanent upgrade to your entire bloodline. A modern comparison, roughly. Imagine the only path to owning a computer, ever, for you or your children or their children, ran through one specific brutal apprenticeship. You'd tolerate a lot of beatings for that. Now here's the part that changes the whole picture. That kid in the Eduba? He was rare, genuinely rare. Historians estimate literacy in ancient Mesopotamia sat somewhere in the low single digits of the population. Some estimates go even lower. Which means the brutal but privileged path you just watched wasn't ancient childhood. It was the exception dressed up as the rule. So what was actually happening to most kids? They were working. Not helping around the house in the way we mean it today, actually working, with real output expected from shockingly young ages. In Rome, children as young as 6 or 7 were already contributing labor, minding animals, running errands, working alongside parents in shops and fields. There wasn't a cultural concept of childhood as a separate, protected stage of life the way we build it now.
You were basically a smaller, less capable adult, and the expectation was that you'd close that gap as fast as possible. Historians actually argue about how far to take this. The old theory, from historian Philippe Aries, claimed that the very idea of childhood as a distinct, protected phase barely existed before the modern era, that kids were treated more or less like miniature adults the moment they could function. Later historians pushed back hard, showing that plenty of ancient and medieval sources do show real tenderness toward children, real grief at their deaths, real awareness that kids were different. The honest answer sits in between. People absolutely loved and worried over their children, but the world still put them to work early, and it did not soften reality on their behalf. Part of why the world couldn't soften reality is a fact that's uncomfortable to sit with, but it's necessary if you actually want to understand ancient parenting rather than judge it from a distance. Child mortality was staggering by modern standards. Historians estimate that in much of the ancient world, something close to a third of children didn't survive to age 10. Some regions and periods likely worse. That's not a detail. That reshapes an entire culture's relationship to childhood itself.
When survival to adulthood is genuinely uncertain, a society organizes around building competence and toughness fast, because there may not be time for anything gentler. This doesn't mean parents cared less. Grief inscriptions from Rome and Egypt make it painfully clear they didn't. It means the margin for a slow, protected childhood simply wasn't there the way it is now. Now look at a Roman household through that lens, and a specific legal detail makes it even stranger. The head of a Roman family, the paterfamilias, held something called patria potestas, legal authority over his children that, on paper, was almost absolute, technically extending even to life and death decisions, though in practice rarely exercised that far. A Roman child wasn't just expected to work. Legally, they weren't fully their own person until the father died or formally released them, and that could stretch well into adulthood. Compare that to a Sumerian scribe's son, whose whole future ran through a teacher's approval instead of a father's legal grip. Different mechanism, same underlying reality. An ancient child's life was never fully their own to direct. Every path ran through someone else's authority first. Sparta took this to the most extreme version anyone's ever documented.
At age 7, boys were pulled from their families entirely and enrolled in the Agoge, a state-run training system built to produce soldiers, not citizens in the broad sense. Deliberately underfed, encouraged to steal food to survive, and punished, brutally, not for stealing, but for getting caught. Think about what that actually teaches. Not don't steal. It teaches be good enough that you never get caught. That's a completely different lesson, and it's a chillingly effective one if your entire society runs on producing soldiers who don't panic under pressure.
Egypt lands somewhere gentler, at least on the surface. Tomb paintings show children playing. Balls, dolls, board games like Senate, wrestling, tug of war. There was room for play here in a way Sparta never allowed. But the same paintings that show kids playing also show kids working. In the fields, alongside animals, learning a trade by standing next to a parent and copying, hour after hour, until the copying became competence. Play and labor weren't opposites. They sat right next to each other, sometimes in the same afternoon. There's one more system worth putting on the table, because it makes Sparta look almost restrained. In the Aztec Empire, boys entered formal schooling around age 15, sorted by class. Commoners went to the Telpochkali, training for war and community labor.
The elite, and those marked for priesthood or leadership, went to the Calmecac, and the Calmecac was punishing on a level that's hard to overstate. Fasting, pre-dawn cold water rituals, bloodletting as religious discipline, severe punishment for failure that, by some accounts, included being pierced with maguey spines. This wasn't a side effect of the system, it was the system's entire theory of how you build someone fit to lead, through voluntarily chosen suffering, absorbed young, before the stakes got real. 3 completely different civilizations, a tablet house in Mesopotamia, a training camp in Sparta, a fasting hall in the Aztec capital. None of them knew the others existed. And they all landed on some version of the same idea.
If you want a child to become someone capable of holding real power or responsibility, you don't protect them from difficulty. You hand it to them early, on purpose, before the cost of failure gets high enough to actually hurt them. But here's the problem with stopping the story here. If all you take from this is ancient childhood was just harsher, you're missing the actual mechanism, the thing that made kids who survived all this come out unusually capable. And to see it clearly, you have to look somewhere that isn't ancient at all.
Anthropologists who study hunter-gatherer societies today, groups like the Hadza in Tanzania or the Juhushwansi in southern Africa, have spent decades documenting something that looks nothing like Sparta and nothing like the Eduba. These aren't literal ancient people, obviously, they're modern communities. But researchers use them as the closest living analog we have to how humans likely raised children for the vast majority of our history, before farming, before cities, before schools existed at all. And what they found flips the whole brutal ancient childhood story on its head. Anthropologist Barry Hewlett, who's spent years studying these communities, documented something striking. Almost no formal teaching happens, no lectures, no correction-heavy instruction. Kids are given enormous autonomy, genuinely startling amounts by modern standards, and they learn almost everything through play and direct observation. A toddler watches an adult dig for tubers, then goes and digs a hole of their own, badly, right next to them. Nobody's grading it. Nobody's beating them for getting it wrong. The play itself is the curriculum. Anthropologist Alyssa Crittenden, who has spent years studying Hadza foraging behavior specifically in children, has documented something equally counterintuitive. Young Hadza children forage on their own, in mixed age groups, largely unsupervised, and they're genuinely good at it, identifying edible tubers, locating baobab fruit, managing real caloric contribution to the group well before anyone would call them old enough by modern standards.
Not pretend contribution, actual calories that matter. There's no ceremony around it, no test, no gold star. It's just expected, the way breathing is expected, and the expectation itself seems to be enough. Think of it like a flight simulator. A simulator lets a pilot crash 100 times with zero real-world cost until the moves become instinct. And then, when it's real, the instinct's already there. That's what this kind of childhood play is doing. Digging, throwing, tracking, fire tending, mimicking hunts with tiny bows. None of it has real stakes yet, but it's rehearsing the exact muscle memory and judgment the kid will need the moment the stakes become real. And there's a deeper reason this style of learning works so well, one that developmental psychologists keep circling back to. Teaching, in the formal sense, is actually a fairly recent human invention. For the overwhelming majority of human history, kids learned the way Hadza kids still do, by watching, imitating, playing, failing in low-stakes ways, and slowly closing the gap between watching an adult do it and doing it themselves. Formal instruction, a teacher standing at the front correcting errors in real time, is a comparatively new layer stacked on top of a much older, much slower, much more autonomous learning system.
Which raises an odd question worth sitting with. When the Eduba forced formal correction onto Mesopotamian kids, was it actually more advanced than the hunter-gatherer model? Or was it just a harsher, higher-stakes patch bolted onto a system built for something gentler? Now, here's the shift that ties all four of these worlds together: Mesopotamia, Sparta, the Aztec Calmecac, and the hunter-gatherer play model. Because on the surface, they could not look more different. One's beating kids over handwriting, one's starving kids on purpose, one's piercing them with mogwai spines, one barely disciplines at all. So what's the actual thread connecting them? It's not harshness. That's the wrong lens entirely. The thread is integration. In every single one of these worlds, a child's activity, whether it's play, labor, or lessons, was directly, immediately connected to real adult consequence. The Mesopotamian boy's tablet errors mattered because scribal accuracy mattered in real temple records. The Spartan boy's theft mattered because getting caught in real combat gets you killed. The Aztec initiate's fasting mattered because leadership itself was believed to require that exact discipline. The hunter-gatherer toddler's digging mattered because in a few years that same motion would be feeding people. Nothing these kids did was a rehearsal, walled off from reality. It was reality, just at a smaller scale.
To be honest about the other side of this, Integration this tight also had a real cost, and it's worth not romanticizing it. We genuinely don't know how much lasting psychological harm the corporal side of these systems caused. The sources that survive are mostly written by the system's successes, the ones who made it through and went on to write things down, not the ones it broke. That's a real gap in the evidence, and it's worth flagging honestly rather than smoothing over for the sake of a clean story. Compare that to how a modern classroom usually works. A wrong answer on a worksheet has almost no downstream consequence. It doesn't touch anyone's dinner, anyone's safety, anyone's standing in the group. And that's not a criticism, it's a trade-off, made deliberately, because we decided protecting kids from real-world consequence was worth more than the competence that comes from facing it early. But it does mean something got lost in the trade. The tight loop ancient kids lived in, try something real, fail, feel it immediately, adjust, is exactly the loop modern classrooms mostly remove. That loop is what built the resilience, not the cruelty, the consequence. Run it through all four worlds one more time, and the pattern holds every time. Sumerian scribe, fail, redo the tablet, feel it immediately.
Spartan boy, fail to avoid capture, feel it immediately. Aztec initiate, fail the discipline, feel it immediately. Hadza child, fail to find the tuber, feel the group notice, adjust tomorrow. 4 civilizations, 0 contact with each other, 1 repeated design. That's not coincidence. That's what happens when real stakes are the only teacher available. There's a modern echo of this worth naming, because it's the reason this topic isn't just historical trivia. Educational researchers today talk about something called desirable difficulty, the finding that learning sticks better when it involves real friction, real risk of failure, real effort, rather than smooth, low-stakes delivery. It's a much gentler, ethically defensible cousin of what these ancient systems were doing by accident, or by necessity, or by design, depending on which culture you're looking at. We didn't invent the insight that struggle builds retention. We just finally found a version of it that doesn't require a stick, a mogwai spine, or a missed meal. So go back to the boy in the Eduba. He survives the beatings. He survives the corrections, the redone lines, the aching hand. And by the time he's grown, he's not just literate. He's part of a network that runs the temples, the courts, the palace archives, a network his own sons will likely be born straight into.
The brutality wasn't the point. It was the filter. What came out the other side was a kid who could take real correction, absorb it, and come back the next morning and do the line again. That's not a skill schools usually measure, but it's the one his entire economy ran on. You're still 8 years old, clay tablet in your lap. Except now you know what that ache in your hand actually is. It's not just punishment. It's the sound of a kid being welded, one wedge mark at a time, into the one system in his world that couldn't be taken from him. Every civilization in this video found its own version of that same ache. A stick in Sparta, a mogwai spine in the Calmecac, a missed meal in the bush, a redone line in the tablet house. And every one of them was betting on the same quiet idea, that a child who feels the real weight of a real mistake, early and often, comes out the other side able to carry weight nobody else can. We softened that bet, maybe for good reason, but it's worth knowing what we traded away to make the ache go quiet. The clay dries, and whatever shape it's holding when it hardens, that's the shape it keeps.